So, welcome, Stuart Maxwell. It's lovely to have you back in our Scotland's offices, and we're celebrating 25 years of the Scottish Parliament, which seems hard to get your head round. So you were in there from 2003, you were very much part of some of the early work on health. What was it like being part of a new-ish Parliament?
Well, it was exciting. For me, it was just an amazing opportunity. I never thought I would be an elected parliamentarian. I wasn't really interested in going to Westminster, so the Parliament coming along was a tremendous opportunity. And it was a tremendous opportunity to do new things, to do things that we wanted to do in Scotland, get them done faster or get them done differently. So the fact that it was new meant there weren't really rules in the sense that people didn't say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that apart from what was not allowed by the legislation, but you could explore new areas, you could make new alliances, you could suddenly talk to all sorts of people and organisations who really were experts in some areas that you were interested in. And the opening up of that, I think, was just a fascinating time, certainly in my life.
So how did you get interested in health issues and particularly tobacco issues?
Well, I've always been interested as an amateur. I feel like, it's one of those things that I think it's an interesting subject. I was interested because I had a young family member who was very ill and had breathing difficulties, and so was perhaps hypersensitive from years before. I got elected about areas where there was pollutants in the air, so heavy traffic or environments where people were smoking indoors at that time. And so perhaps that was, even though I didn't realise at the time, was perhaps a seed that was planted. And then when I came to Parliament, then the opportunity, because of course there was the talk in Ireland, and Ireland was on the cusp of bringing in their legislation, that this was an opportunity that a new Parliament could seize, and it was certainly an area I was interested in because not only was, as I say, a very young family member affected by breathing difficulties in polluted atmospheres, I've never, on a very personal level, found it very enjoyable to be in smoky atmospheres. I always suffered from a very bad sore throat, so all my life I was never happy with being in areas like that. But it was not something that you could do anything about. It was just the norm in society. So I suppose the opportunity for change, what was happening in places like Ireland and New York, very much were brought to my attention. I read as much as I could about what was happening in these places, and when I was elected, I thought this is something we should at least see whether or not we can do.
And where did you start with that?
Well, I started by actually speaking to Bruce Crawford, who was the SNP business manager at the time and the Minister for Parliamentary Business. Because I was a new member, I wasn't sure what the rules were and whether I could just rush off and do things. He was very supportive of the idea. Kenny Gibson, of course, had been working on this to some extent. He wasn't re-elected, so there was nobody else really pursuing the idea. So once there was no issue for no blockages in my way, from a party point of view, I went and spoke to the parliamentary authorities, the bills unit that supported members' bills, to see whether or not this was something I could do and how I would go about it. And I'm delighted to say that the members of the bills unit were as equally excited by such a bill as I was, and were a huge support in making sure we could take through that process. It gave me enormous help in drafting, and made sure that we could get the consultation up and out as quickly as possible. So it was actually launched very quickly in 2003 because of the support from one or two individual members of the Parliament across parties, but particularly I have to say the Bills Unit initially. And that really was what led me to announce that I was doing it and start the consultation. Which, interestingly enough, the responses to the consultation were, I can't remember exactly, but kind of I feel like it was 99% support. It was that high a level of support for the idea, but it was also the largest response to a members' bills consultation at that time. I don't know if it's probably changed by now, but at that time it was the most responses they'd had to a consultation.
And what did your bill set out to do?
Well, we had many meetings about discussing how how far and how fast we could go. It's difficult to remember now what it was like, but at that time, it was not the perceived view of most people that such a thing, could happen or could in fact be enforced, or in fact many people thought it was actually, would be very unwelcome and the public wouldn't support it. It would be very opposed by the general public. I felt exactly the opposite. I felt the general public were way ahead of the politicians, the media, and everybody else at that time. But I got media opposition, I got industry opposition, obviously, although not in the early days. They just ignored it. But effectively, I think the biggest, change was when we suddenly got a bit of attention, media attention. And that suddenly got a lot of attention from a lot of organisations who hadn't even noticed the consultation, because we, again, forget that even many sizable organisations who operated in the field of public health, even the professional organisations, still looked to Westminster, still had full-time officers in Westminster. They still were in that kind of mindset, hadn't really got to grips with the idea that the Scottish Parliament had primary legislative powers and could do a lot more than they perceived. Things that they would support, as well as things they maybe wouldn't support. But that certainly, there was a lack of interest in some people's part, a lack of knowledge certainly amongst a lot of organisations. And that, in a sense, was very helpful to me, because there was just an empty space that I could work in and gather support in and make proposals in. But effectively, we were cautious about the drafting of legislation. Because there was such a widespread level of opposition, we weren't sure whether we could get it through the Parliament. And it came down to a choice between a bill supporting a full ban or a bill supporting a partial ban, so a ban that would be in place where food was being served. And we chose the more restrictive ban on the grounds it would be more likely to be supported, but it was drafted in such a way that, if I remember correctly, 6 amendments would transfer it from what it was to a full ban. So it was there with the hope that the public would move along with us, that parliamentarians would support it, and we could then, as the parliamentary process progressed, actually gain support, and then we would move the bill forward as far as we could to make sure we could get it through. So it was a very different world at that point.
Yeah, there was a lot of unknowns about that level of change or how it was perceived before it happened. And I think there was some really good debate in Parliament, because the industry wasn't on it and wasn't involved with the Scottish Parliament as it was with Westminster, because things were so new, and I think we flew under the radar. Was that your impression? Very much so. I mean, I think much to my benefit and to those who supported it. iScotland, of course, supported that legislation. I don't want to say we got away with it, but effectively, we could operate, we could effectively campaign, we could operate in Parliament, debate, question. I asked a number of First Minister's questions at the time. It was the Labour Liberal executive at that time. We could do a lot of work. We could garner a lot of support amongst public health professionals, organisations, third sector organisations, and all of that went on with no interference whatsoever from the industry. They didn't write to MSPs, didn't ask for meetings. Effectively, I couldn't say for sure, but it felt to me that they either just ignored it or hadn't understood the legislative power of the Parliament. And in fact, much later on, one of them did say to me that they hadn't understood that the Parliament could have those powers, because they looked at it from a Westminster point of view and felt the Scottish Parliament couldn't legislate in this area. But of course we were legislating on public health, which was devolved, and they hadn't looked at it as a public health measure. So what happened to that private member's bill?
Well, the bill was published, got a lot of media attention by that point, although behind the scenes, much of the then journalists thought it was very funny and told me that it was one of the funniest things they had seen, because not in their lifetime would such a piece of legislation ever pass. They felt it was impossible to think of a pub without smokers in it. So for them it was funny, but it did garner a lot of attention, and that then garnered even more support. We did work very hard to get organisations working in this field to lend public support right from the start, from the launch of the bill, and that in the most part we got most organisations, but we didn't get all organisations supporting it, rather surprisingly. But I think they were also a bit naive and puzzled and confused about what you could do, what you couldn't do, and how it would work. So, but we did get a lot of support at that point. But it did allow us to then work in the Parliament. I spent a lot of time trying to get support amongst politicians across the Parliament. It's, as I say, it sounds ridiculous now, but at the time you had to get 11 members across the Parliament, across several parties, to sign a proposal before you could even start a bill. And that proved extremely difficult. You would think 11 would be pretty, including me. So you needed 10 other members, and it was very, very difficult to get members to support it. Everybody thought it was, something the public wouldn't support, and therefore didn't want to risk their own position or their electoral chances by being seen as somebody who banned smoking, as they saw it. And in fact, that was a question I got often in the media. My first interview on Radio 4 Today programme about the bill, the first question was, "So you're not interested in a career in politics then?" was the very first question. And I said, "I'm very interested in a career in politics, and I believe that actually the public is way ahead of everybody else on this, and there's widespread support in the public." That was my view. I think that proved to be correct. In fact, Radio Scotland did a live piece from just outside here in Princes Street one day with me, a lunchtime show, and they asked members of the public walking past what they thought of this idea. Their expectation was there would be a lot of people who were very angry about it, and there would be opposition, and they would get good radio from it, and every single person they asked supported it. They couldn't find one single person walking along Princes Street who opposed it. And I think things like that started to seep into the sort of wider media consciousness, and politicians began to recognise that it was successful in New York, then it was successful in Ireland. Maybe we could do it, and maybe it wouldn't be political suicide to do it. So things began to speed up and change quite rapidly. But at first it was a real slog.
So I think you're right. Actually, there's a rewrite in history in the rear view mirror that it was all dead easy and obvious at the time, and people forget how much hard work and fighting had to go in for it.
Yeah, George Reid. I always remember George Reid. And that was a bit of a scary moment in a sense, because when he spoke up, and he was a very senior figure, he thought, well, and I knew from inside, from talking to ministers privately, Labour ministers privately, some very good ministers who supported, no longer with us unfortunately, like Tom, they were concerned that the UK Labour Party, Labour government would not allow them, maybe that's the wrong phrase, but certainly put pressure on the Labour Party in Scotland to not support this legislation, because that's where the industry was focusing its efforts, I think, and so there was concern. And so somebody like George Reid, a very senior figure, coming out so publicly and opposing it, I felt there were very serious risks and dangers to the legislation at that point, or it would be watered down at the very least. I'm glad to say that didn't happen. And it did show that Parliament could do things differently, didn't have to do the same things right across the UK. We could leap, because as we did with that and the rest of the UK followed, I think that was one of those defining moments. But yeah, it was a tough couple of years. I got a number of threats of physical violence. I got a number of letters threatening me and my family. I think it was 2 death threats. All of which was handed to the police, and some of the security services came to see me, which seems ridiculous now to talk about it. But at the time, you had to take these things seriously. Yeah. But it is one of my, it's an aside, I suppose, but my favourite stories. I wish I'd kept the letter, because it was done in kind of almost B-movie style. It was letters cut out from a newspaper, threatening death and various other horrible things to me, because I was supporting legislation, and it was handed to the security service who came in, took it, the special branch I think it was, took it away, and they came back a while later and said there was no fingerprints on it. You obviously must have worn gloves, but they had got DNA off it, and they would keep the DNA on record just in case this person came to their attention at some future date. And I was a bit puzzled, because you wore gloves, how did you get DNA on a letter? He says, because he obviously had gloves and he folded the letter and very carefully and didn't touch in, and then he licked the envelope. So they got the DNA off. He stuck down the envelope by licking it. So, I mean, a death threat, but also very funny, really. And as they said very reassuringly, people who send you death threats don't commit. That's not it. These are not the people you have to worry about. Right. So it was a very different time. It was a very different experience from the way you think about it now. Now I look back, I'm even puzzled and amused myself by some of that. But it was quite a battle.
Yeah, not reassuring at the time at all.
No, it wasn't. And obviously, I had a group of people came to my door, and I wasn't there. I was out, and my wife was very frightened when they were, shouting at her. Had the police around. So these things, I mean, they weren't. No physical violence took place, but you forget how strongly some people felt about it. At the time. It's funny to think. I hadn't thought about this stuff for a long time, but it's funny to think back now. In that there were days like that were, a concern, and suddenly realising that it wasn't just me that was, at risk, if you like. You were putting other people in harm's way. As I say, nothing happened, but it was a very contentious piece of legislation amongst certain groups, despite it being very widely supported by the public. So.
Yeah. No, I remember that. I remember all the negative media headlines, the doubt, the scepticism that, you can't infringe on smokers' rights, whereas actually no one was talking about the people affected by smoke.
Indeed.
And absolutely the public were ahead of the legislation. So fast forward to what has turned out to be one of the pieces of legislation I think the Scottish Parliament is proudest of, the smoke-free legislation, which came into force in March 2006. It was passed in 2005. You had quite a pivotal role with that too.
Well, I was very involved. I mean, effectively, my bill was going through committee stage when the then Scottish Executive were deciding whether or not to support it or what to do about it. I got a phone call one day from one of the government ministers to say they would, in fact, not be supporting the bill, and they wouldn't, in fact, amend their own piece of health legislation that was going through to include a full ban. And obviously I was delighted by that. That was great. I mean, it would have been nice if they'd supported the bill and we'd made it a full ban, but it was also equally nice that, in fact, it had government support. And that changed the whole dynamic of the things. However, the bill that they introduced, or rather the legislation introduced in that health bill, I felt still, had some gaps in it. I think we did have an argument about age. We had an argument about hotel rooms. We had an argument about lots of things. But one of my concerns, which I argued quite strongly for in Parliament in those debates, was that the industry would try and get round the legislation, because the legislation was drawn quite tightly on tobacco and tobacco only. And I felt there were lots of other products that you could smoke. In fact, I went out into a shop in the street and bought several packets of herbal cigarettes and brought them into Parliament and took them to other party members and showed them the fact that you could buy these, and these would be perfectly legal under that legislation as it stood at that time. So argued strongly that the legislation should be broadened to include, sort of lit products that you smoked. Can't remember the exact wording, something like that, which would then capture other products rather than just tobacco. Because the industry's got a lot of money and a lot of clever people, and I felt if we drew it too narrow, then it would be too easy for them to try and push around it. So we did make, I think, in the end, a number of changes which strengthened the bill. I think it then garnered a lot of support cross party. There were members from all sides who argued against it, including in my own party. There were also members who argued from particular stances. Like I remember one Labour MSP, Polly McNeill, who argued that stage and screen should be exempt because effectively you couldn't possibly replicate smoking on a stage, which did seem to be rather amusing given what we replicate on stage and screen all the time. But I'm glad to see that amendment was defeated. So we ended up, I think, with a much stronger bill that was very wide in terms of covering amongst all of society and public places, and has stood the test of time. It's 2006, as you say, it came in. We're 18 years later, and I think it's one of the best, if not the best, bits of legislation we've passed. It's been robust, it's held up. There's been no problems with enforcement, and it's remained strongly supported by the public even today. So I think that whole process worked very well, and was a kind of a bit of a shining light in terms of how to do the legislative process well. Other bits of bills have not gone so well, but that particular bill I think went very well. And the Parliament, I think, showed itself to be quite mature on that debate. So I was very pleased with how it went.
And I think capturing lit smoke materials, including herbal cigarettes, was a stroke of genius, because we see how the industry kind of bypasses regulations wherever there's a wee loophole. There was definite industry opposition at that time. They came in at a late stage, and they tried to change the debate, and they were too late, I think.
Yes, I mean, the industry even then was widely known for its behaviours going back a long time, certainly from the 50s, 60s, 70s. There's lots of stuff that the industry should be ashamed of and was involved in. And it still had a reputation. I think it was not an unfair reputation for trying all that it could to ensure that it got round legislation, it got round restrictions in advertising, it got round any legislation that would impinge on its business, because it only appeared to be interested in the business and not the effects of that business. So I think the industry though was extremely poor at tackling the campaign and then the legislation. It came into the argument extremely late. I mean, I didn't get contact by anybody from the industry until very late on in the process, when they then sought a meeting. Philip Morris, I think it was, sought a meeting late on. They didn't contact even the opponents of the bill. They didn't put any information into the committees until late on. So I think they completely missed a trick. They didn't understand the power of the Scottish Parliament. They didn't appreciate that we could do this. And I say, somebody afterwards from the industry said to me they hadn't understood that this was devolved. They had thought that Westminster had power over this, and therefore they had just ignored it because it was, to them it was of no interest. And the time that they got to understand that it would be a threat to their business, it was too late. At that point the argument had been won, public support was obvious, parliamentary support had been achieved, and it was quite obvious the bill was going to succeed. But as I say, it was even to this day I find it curious that they were so poor at understanding that legislation was going through something and it would affect their business. And I said they either just missed it or they ignored it. I don't quite know, but they certainly didn't understand it.
Wouldn't be the first time they've underestimated Scotland, I would have thought. I really want to commend you for arguing not to have loopholes for artistic reasons or commercial reasons, because I think one of the strengths of Scotland's smoke-free legislation is the exemptions were only made on humanitarian grounds. And there was quite a sort of debate between England and Wales about this, and the BBC put pressure on Wales to allow exemptions for artistic reasons in a workplace. Yes. And they didn't. And there are plenty of ways round it, but it's even still a debate that's came up this week. How do you deal with that in Scotland? Well, it's a workplace, it's acting, there's CGI, all the rest of it.
Well, I went, it's at the time, I got reprimanded by the presiding officer at the time in the chamber for doing this, but I felt it was worth the rap on the knuckles. During the debate, I mean, I must go back and probably film of it. During the debate, when the argument for exempting theatres, and other sort of artistic venues was being made, obviously I realised this was going to happen. I had gone out the previous weekend to what was a very famous joke shop in Glasgow called Tam Shepherd's. You could buy lots of daft jokes products, and I bought cigarettes, fake cigarettes. And what you did was, they looked exactly like a cigarette, but it contained a white powder, like talcum powder or something like that. and it lit at the end, and you, instead of sucking, you blew into it. Pretended you smoked, but you blew into it, and a puff of smoke came out at the end. It was a joke. It was, at that time, a children's toy, strangely enough. But I bought those, and I took them into the debate in the Parliament. And when Pauline McNeill stood up and argued the case for exemptions, I did an intervention and said it's perfectly possible to, fake things on stage and in television and film, but perhaps it is too difficult. Maybe you've got an argument here. Maybe there's maybe I should think about it. And at that time, casually brought up, as I had it in my hand below the desk, and smoked this cigarette, and there was uproar for several seconds, and I got wrapped in knuckles for smoking in the pub. And said it's a joke. And Pauline McNeill had the good grace afterwards because it completely cawed the feet from under her argument, because people in the Parliament thought I was smoking. She came up to me afterwards and had the good grace to say that was really good. That was you completely made your point with that fake cigarette, and that was a cheap thing you could buy in a joke shop. I felt the industry, the BBC and Hollywood could manage to make things which would be a lot better than a £2 joke cigarette from Tam Shivers. But I think it made the point, and I think the argument was flawed fundamentally because, as you've said, it was a workplace. People who happen to work in this industry have the same rights, or should have the same rights, as everybody else to not have their health damaged through secondary passive smoking. So I just felt the argument held no water at all. But it wasn't one of the ones I was concerned about, because there was a lot of sympathy for the argument, even in the Parliament, and I was concerned that the amendment would pass. So I'm glad to say that it didn't pass, and perhaps just that little bit of theatrics on my part helped defeat that amendment.
Nice. So I think Scotland, when I talk to people, the smoke-free legislation is one of the things that people are really proud of in Scotland. And I think it's a good example of what can be done with devolved powers for health. Have you any thoughts on that, where we've come from, where we are, looking forward?
I'm proud of what we've done, and I'm disappointed at the same time of what we've not done. We could have done a lot more than actually has been achieved over the 25 years. So I think in the early days there was lots of innovative thinking, excitement. People were looking for things to do that were, really important and groundbreaking. And I think we've kind of lost that along the way somewhere. I don't know whether that's a change in mood, a change in, attitude. But a lot of the public health things that I would like to have seen, not just in smoking cessation, haven't come to pass. And I think the Parliament has kind of slowed down in its ambition in these areas. And I think while there are lots of good things that Parliament's done, as I say, I think it has missed the trick on public health. And smoking cessation, it seems to me, was really moving at pace at that point. And again, I feel it has lost a bit of its initiative in recent years. There's been bits and pieces have been done, but I kind of think we're still looking at a cohort of the public who are still wedded to smoking, and we haven't really broken that. Obviously, people have a right to smoke. It's a legal product, but it is quite clear that smoking, it is effectively, you could break down the population in a number of ways, and there are certain parts of society who smoke heavily, and there are certain parts of society where virtually nobody smokes. It's very unusual, and that class distinction, if we put it that way, is still there. We haven't broken that down. We haven't really got into a lot of those communities with that message. It hasn't stuck, and while they're not smoking inside pubs anymore, they're still smoking at fairly high rates. So I think it's disappointing that we haven't really, pushed on from the bill to make Scotland a smoke-free society, that I would have hoped to have seen, not quite by now, but to be much further along that path.
So, lessons for the future: be brave.
I think that's the major lesson. I think the Parliament has to be braver. I think individuals have to fight for good legislation that does good things for the people of Scotland. And if they keep that at the forefront of their mind, that they're there to work for the benefit of the people of Scotland, and less about how does this fit our party ideology, then effectively you can do great things. And as I said earlier, the legislation that I was advocating was opposed vehemently by some people in my party, was supported magnificently by people in opposition parties to me. So it doesn't have to be a party political thing you take forward. You can take forward things which are great and good and do marvellous work for the people of Scotland for many years to come, as this legislation has. And I think if they have that in mind, if they think about the kind of bills they want to bring forward that have that kind of impact, then I think we'll maybe see some really great things done. But we'll wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your many contributions to reducing tobacco use, to the Scottish Parliament, to devolved health powers. Thank you for spending time with us today. It's really appreciated. And
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, well done.